On July 3rd, 1840, a devout skeptic experienced something so terrifying that he became a believer instantly. His name was Edward Drury, and he decided to prove once and for all that a house in Northumberland, England was not haunted. The family who lived there claimed that they had been the victims of a haunting that seemingly sprang from nothing. They had lived in the house for several years without a single hint of ghostly activity. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, everyone began to hear these loud, heavy footsteps coming from the third floor. After that, things got progressively worse until eventually each member of the family became terrified to be in their own home. Edward Drury, the man who hoped to debunk this haunting, was a respected medical doctor. History repeatedly described this man as a committed skeptic and a thorough unbeliever.
I decided that I would spend the night at this so-called haunted house because of the many strange rumours I'd heard from very respectable people, especially a detailed report told to me by my good friend Mr. Davidson.
Dr. Drury arrived at the house early on the evening of July 3rd, 1840, with a friend named Thomas Hudson. There was no doubt in this doctor's mind. He was going to expose this for what it was, a hoax. Well, first they carefully inspected every room of the house, from the kitchen to the attic, looking for anything that someone would be able to use to fabricate a haunting. And they found nothing that would enable that type of trickery. Then, around 11 p.m., they settled into that room on the third floor, the area of the house that most of the haunting had been reported. Drury was ready for anything, absolutely confident that he could explain away even the slightest hint of any ghostly activity. Well, all was quiet until about midnight. That's when the first strange noises began. A scattered pattering like dozens of bare feet moving across the floor in different places. The sound was so unusual that neither man could tell exactly where it was coming from. Then, a few moments later, there was this knocking that came from the floorboards right at Drury's feet, as if invisible knuckles were rapping on the floor. Simple trick, right? Obviously, someone in the room below. Well, if this was the best that they could do, well, it was going to be easy for the doctor to expose this hoax. But then, after a couple more strange noises, everything just died down. Got real quiet. So quiet, in fact, that after a while, Hudson fell asleep from boredom. Well, this was disappointing. How could Dr. Drury expose a hoax if nothing were happening? Well, shortly after this, things got real. The closet door slowly began to open. And what happened next terrified the doctor to such a degree that he actually passed out, and he remained passed out for 3 solid hours. When he finally came to, he noticed that along with this horrible headache, he also had this powerful ringing in his right ear, a sound that would stay with him as a reminder of this event for the rest of his life. Well, a week later, he would write an apology letter to Joseph, stating that no one was more skeptical than he was, and no one could have been more wrong. In the letter, he would detail exactly what had terrified him during those few short minutes right before he passed out, and we'll share what that was in just a bit. But the horror that had culminated with this doctor completely changing his worldview had been steadily growing inside of this house for more than 5 years. And as I said earlier, it seemed to have just come up from nothing. The place was called the Willington Mill House. It was built right around 1800 between Newcastle and North Shields in Northumberland, England. In 1831, a man named Joseph Procter, a devout Quaker, moved his wife Elizabeth and their young family into the house. The previous occupants, his cousins, had lived there for 25 quiet years without a single disturbance. One of the things that makes this case so interesting, though, is that Joseph Procter, the man who supplied most of the information about the case, was known to be a person of the absolute highest integrity. All of the records of the time show that he was a very humble person. He was an overseer for his church, He was deeply involved in the anti-slavery movement, and he was a member of the Peace Society. He didn't engage in frivolous activity, and he never drank. In short, he wasn't at all the type of person that one would imagine to fabricate a haunting, and he kept a meticulous diary, recording only what he himself witnessed or what he deemed to be reliable reports from family members. For the first 3.5 years that the family lived there was nothing, no ghostly activity at all. Then, for some reason, late in 1834, everything changed. It started with the nanny. One night, she was up in the nursery, putting one of the children to sleep, when she heard these loud, deliberate footsteps coming from the floor above her. At first, it was just startling, but after a moment, she reasoned that someone must be up in that room doing something. This room was on the 3rd floor, and many decades earlier, even before the previous tenants had moved in, rumors circulated that for some reason, it was haunted.
My wife and I were informed by the previous tenants that they understood that that house, and that room in particular, was said to be haunted before they moved in 1806. But they never experienced anything strange or heard any odd noises during their occupancy of 25 years.
The nanny finished her task and then moved on, but the next night these footsteps returned, and they were more powerful than the night before. So powerful, in fact, that they rattled the windows in the nursery, where the nanny was. This was more than startling. Well, she quickly found out that no one had been up in that room that night or the night before. This became a pattern, happening night after night. Eventually, she told Mrs. Procter, Elizabeth, who just chalked it up to the nanny hearing things and then letting her mind run wild. Soon, however, this became too much for the poor girl, and she quit, absolutely terrified and believing 100% that something supernatural was happening inside of that house. Well, a replacement nanny was hired, and she was not told what the previous girl had experienced. But somehow, within days, she too started hearing the exact same loud, powerful footsteps in that room above the nursery. So, just like the previous nanny, she went and told Elizabeth. Well, this was a coincidence for sure, but Elizabeth just could not believe that something supernatural was happening in her house. It had to be new job jitters, or most probably it was that this new nanny had heard rumors from the last one. So at first, Elizabeth just ignored this information. But then, one day, Elizabeth herself was in the nursery, and she heard the footsteps coming from above. But she didn't let her mind get the best of her. No, instead, she reasoned that the sound must be coming from one of the servants doing chores. So she inquired, and to her dismay, she discovered that all of the servants had been accounted for, and none of them had been anywhere near that room. So she called for her husband, Joseph, who ran up to the room to catch whoever was up there. Now, this is the interesting part, because he opened the door and he could clearly see that the room was completely empty. But more importantly, and this is crazy, there was this thick layer of dust that had built up over the years, and it had completely covered the floor, and there wasn't a single footprint anywhere in it. Well, this was the turning point. Until Elizabeth herself had heard these powerful footsteps, the family could go on telling themselves that this was just the nannies being spooked. But now, the woman of the house had experienced it too. After that, eventually everyone in the family also heard it, and it was unmistakable. Deliberate, heavy footsteps from some unseen person who never ever left any evidence. If these footsteps had been the only mysterious things that had ever happened to this family, it still would have been an interesting case. But they weren't. Soon, these disturbances would spread to every level of the house, and they would become much more than just footsteps.
Welcome to Velarcana. Here we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, and my husband tells the stories.
The strange activity at the Willington Mill House continued and intensified. Before long, each family member began to hear strange sounds all throughout the house. One of them, heard by Joseph, sounded like a gunshot, but no gun had been fired. Then, one night, things escalated. Elizabeth was sleeping in the nursery with her children and the nanny when someone lifted the bed. Not very high, just a bit, as if someone were beneath it, pushing up on it. Neither woman said anything. Each just lay there, kind of acting like she were asleep, thinking that the other woman must somehow be making the bed do this, even though that would have been impossible, as both women were laying side by side. Well, at breakfast, they shared their experience, and they described the same sensation. Something strong and deliberate, pushing upward from below, like a man on all fours, using his back, pushing up. One of the children, Joseph Jr., had it even worse. One night he cried out, screaming that someone or something was underneath his crib. When the family entered the room, he said that something had lifted the mattress with him on it up and down several times really fast. Well, the family checked everywhere, but there was nothing. Then, along with those heavy footsteps on the third floor, other steps were heard. At one point, it sounded as if someone were running up and down the stairs, but the stairs, of course, were empty. Then more sounds filled the house. One of them resembled coal being raked or dragged across the floor. Occasionally, and this one would scare me to death, there would be this loud banging sound right next to someone. Well, that person would jump, and then they would look, and of course, there would be nothing there. Then things went to the next level, and strange apparitions began appearing. The first to see them was Joseph's daughter, and it was terrifying because it was a disembodied head.
Little Jane Procter, 4.5 years old, saw a strange-looking head by the washstand at the foot of the bed. She said she thought it was an old woman. Several days later, around dusk, she saw another head on the landing while coming downstairs. She was very badly frightened by this.
Then the neighbors began seeing things in the windows.
Two of the children saw, without knowing that the other had seen it, an object that couldn't have been real float into one of the rooms on the second floor. At the same time, a respectable neighbor saw a transparent white female figure standing in the window of that same room.
Then the foreman, Thomas Mann, and his wife saw what they said looked like a priest in that same window.
Thomas Mann's wife stepped aside and was startled by a figure in the same window. She called her husband. He saw it too. It was walking back and forth, and then it stood still. It was very bright and completely transparent, and it looked like a priest wearing a white robe. It stayed visible for a full 10 minutes before fading. Then it appeared to step straight into the wall.
Sometime later, one night while Thomas was outside, he thought that he saw a cat appear from nowhere, but it was dark, so he couldn't really tell. As the cat moved closer, however, there was something about it that just wasn't right, something that Thomas couldn't quite put his finger on. And once it got close enough, well, that feeling became overwhelming, and Thomas kicked it, or at least he tried. Instead of his boot connecting with the cat, it just went straight through it, as if the cat wasn't even there. Well, a second later, the cat vanished into thin air. Before the night was over, Thomas would see two more creatures that didn't feel quite right. One was a rabbit, and it appeared just like the cat had. And then it made its way over to Thomas. And just like with the cat, there was something about this rabbit that just wasn't right. And it kept moving closer and closer. It finally got right up on Thomas, and he kicked at it just like he had done with the cat. And just like with the cat, his foot passed straight through it. And then just like with the cat, it vanished. The third creature wasn't any animal that Thomas recognized. He said it was about the size of a sheep, and it was glowing. Well, this was just way too much for Thomas, and he froze. Every muscle locked. The creature moved on and then disappeared in the exact same spot that the other two had. Later, Thomas said that if hair actually could stand on end, then his had done so that night. After that, the appearances of these strange apparitions increased. There was a lady in a lavender silk dress, an old bald man wearing a long white robe, another lady dressed in gray, and a horrifying eyeless specter that stared straight out from empty sockets. Well, by this time, the family was living under constant, unrelenting pressure. Life inside of the Willington Mill House had become a daily test of courage and sanity. Neighbors and others in the community had heard rumors, and eventually, a local doctor named Edward Drury openly scoffed at the stories, stating that there were no such things as ghosts. Whenever someone would try to defend Joseph's integrity, the doctor would simply say, "Oh yeah? Well, put me in that house for a night. See what happens. I'll show you that there's no such things as ghosts." Well, on July 3rd, 1840, the good doctor, he got his wish. The haunting at the Willington Mill House had seemingly come out of nowhere in late 1834, and it had grown in intensity over time. The family could barely sleep. The pressure was becoming unbearable. They tried everything, searching rooms, sitting up all night long, even inviting friends over to witness and then help brainstorm answers. But nothing stopped it, and by 1840, the whole neighborhood was talking, and that's when Edward Drury stepped in. He was a respected physician from Sunderland. He was a man of science who laughed at ghost stories. He wrote to Joseph Procter asking permission to stay the night alone in the house, and to his surprise, Joseph agreed. So on July 3rd, 1840, Joseph made sure that his family was away and the doctor was invited in. Well, Dr. Drury met Joseph at his house with a friend of his named Thomas Hudson. Dr. Drury announced that he was carrying pistols. He wanted to make it absolutely clear that any prankster better tread lightly, as this was not a joke. He was there for the sole purpose of exposing this for what it was, a hoax. Well, Joseph allowed the doctor and his companion full access to every room in the house. The two men inspected every square inch. Then, around 11 o'clock, they settled into that room on the third floor. Dr. Drury was determined to explain away every single sound with logic. And as I stated in the beginning, the very first noises came just before midnight. It sounded as if a dozen bare feet were running across the floor, but the only people in the room were the doctor and his friend Hudson. Well, a few moments later, there came that sharp knocking right beneath where the doctor was standing, as if someone was rapping his knuckles on the floorboards right there at the doctor's boots, but there was no one there. Then there was this howling, ghostly cough or breath, which echoed in the air from the nothingness like a haunting whisper. None of this affected the doctor, not even in the slightest. And then after all of that, everything was quiet. It got so dull, actually, that Hudson eventually fell asleep. Well, the doctor looked over at his partner, saw him snoozing, and then he pulled out his watch. 3 hours later, the doctor was waking up downstairs, instantly changed from skeptic to believer. A week later, the doctor wrote Joseph an apology.
Dear Sir, I'm happy to state that I'm really surprised I've been so little affected after that horrid and most awful affair at your home last week. The only lasting effect is this heavy dullness in my right ear. I call it heavy dullness because I do not hear distinctly, and there is a constant noise inside it. I never had this before, and I doubt it will ever go away. I went to your house more disbelieving than anyone alive. That night, I took out my watch. It was 10 minutes to 1. When I looked up, my eyes became fixed to the closet door, which I distinctly saw open slowly, revealing the figure of a female, attired in grey garments. Her head was tilted down, and one hand pressed upon her chest, as if she were in pain. The other hand extended towards the floor, with the index finger pointing downwards. She moved cautiously across the floor. As she reached my friend, who was asleep, she extended her right hand toward him. So I immediately rushed at the figure, giving a most awful yell. But instead of grabbing it, I went straight through it and fell onto my friend. I recollected nothing clearly for nearly 3 hours afterwards. I have since learned that I was carried downstairs in an agony of fear and terror. Now, no one can be more satisfied than myself. I am persuaded that what I saw with my own 2 eyes was a punishment to me for my scoffing and unbelief.
Dr. Drury had walked in a pompous and proud skeptic, but he left a broken man who actually begged the Procters to never let their children sleep in that house ever again. Unfortunately, the Procters had nowhere else to go, and things would only get worse before they got better. And the last night that the Procters were there, well, it sounded as if the ghosts were all packing up so that they could move with them. The Procters didn't move out for several more years, and during that time, they experienced some of the worst parts of this haunting. I'm not going to go over all of it, but here are a few parts that I thought were particularly interesting. On October 13th, 1841, Joseph Jr., who was 8 years old at the time, felt something pulling at his shoe. He looked down and he discovered that a monkey had come out of nowhere. While a second later, the monkey ran underneath the bed and then vanished into thin air. A short time after that, Joseph Jr. again saw this boy who looked exactly like him, wearing the exact same clothes, same hat, having the exact same appearance. The boy was calmly, emotionlessly walking back and forth in Joseph Jr.'s bedroom. What? Was he trying to replace Joseph Jr.? Eerie. Joseph's journal entries state that his son was absolutely terrified by this. Well, eventually, the Procters secured the means to move, and on their very last night, the house erupted in a final furious outburst. The sounds were strange, boxes being dragged down the stairs with heavy thuds, non-human footsteps stomping across the floors, doors slamming violently, furniture being shoved and corded as if invisible hands were packing up the entire house, getting ready to move. It was the perfect ghostly pantomime of their departure. Joseph and Elizabeth couldn't sleep the entire night, not so much because of the noise. No, by this time they had grown used to the noise. They couldn't sleep because they were terrified that whatever was in that house just might be packing itself up in order to move with them to their new home. Thankfully, it didn't. In 1847, the Procters finally left the Willington Mill House. They settled in South Shields, and for the first time in 13 years, they slept without fear. The disturbances, interestingly enough, stopped the very moment that they left. The house itself fell completely silent again. Years passed, and the old mill house was eventually divided up into small tenements. None of the people who moved in ever reported anything unusual. Whatever had tormented that poor family for over a decade simply vanished the moment that they moved away, which of course raises skeptical eyebrows, right? If there really was a haunting, then why did it stop just because the family moved? It didn't even follow them to their new place. And I've said it before, old houses make noises, floors settle, boards creak, and a family under distress just might see patterns where none exist, right? Joseph Procter was a good, honest person, but even honest people can be mistaken. And the world has no physical proof. There's no photographs, no recordings, just the written accounts from the people who lived through it. Maybe it was just imaginations stretched to the breaking point. Maybe the house was never haunted at all. Now, to be fair, the Procters were known to be solid, sober people with the highest integrity. And Joseph was said to have kept that journal with the same precision that he ran his mill with and raised his kids with. And dozens of witnesses, servants, relatives, neighbors, even that skeptical doctor whose life was changed forever, all described the same impossible things. The sounds that shook the windows in the nursery but left no footprints. the figures seen in the windows and out in the yard, the beds that lifted with people still in them. This is an interesting story for sure. But Amy wasn't at all satisfied once she researched it. No, that's because no one has really ever been able to explain or even suggest a satisfying theory as to exactly what this haunting was all about. It's like this random anomaly in the world of the paranormal. So she looked high and low, and eventually she stumbled into some local records and she found something that, as far as we know, no one else ever has. Now, check this out. On November 24th, 1834, just weeks before the very first footsteps shook those nursery windows at the Willington Mill House, a box arrived in Newcastle by steamship from Scotland. It was simply marked, a passenger. Inside was a coffin. Its destination? St. Nicholas Church. Inside of the coffin was the body of a woman. The register simply listed her as Helen Tatlock. The instructions were clear. Bury this woman quickly and quietly. No reason was given other than she was not to be buried in Scotland, as if a scandal had taken place. No family members were there to claim the body when it arrived. No, it went straight to the church and then to the graveyard. Where exactly the body came from and who was Helen Tatlock? Well, that's still a mystery, one that feels deliberately hidden from history. But how and where the body ended up? Well, there's no mystery there at all. She was buried just 8.4 kilometers from the Willington Mill House, and perhaps just days before the disturbances began. Her corpse was a hurried, secretive arrival in the dead of November, rushed across the North Sea and laid to rest with almost no one knowing. And I think that's interesting. So what really happened inside of the Willington Mill House? Maybe it was nothing more than just old wood and worried minds. Or maybe, just maybe, something restless crossed that cold North Sea in a box marked a passenger, found its way to a quiet Quaker home, and then finally got whatever it had come for when the last door closed and the family left. Either way, if you ever find yourself driving through Northumberland on a dark November night, you just might catch yourself wondering, did Helen Tatlock finally get the piece that she was looking for? Or is she somewhere out there still waiting for someone to listen?
The more I read the diary entries in this case, the more I was fascinated by the different forms that the haunting took. A woman in gray, animals, a priest, an apparition that looked exactly like Joseph Jr. And then, when I found the information about Helen Tatlock, well, it made me wonder, what exactly was it that was trying to connect? We may never know, but I do believe the Procter family experienced something real. You know, at the end of each video, we show these names. They're the people who've supported our work over the past few weeks. If you value the time and research that goes into these stories, and that they're told by humans and not AI, then supporting us on Buy Me a Coffee really does help. We're just a small husband and wife team, and your support allows us to keep digging, keep researching, and keep telling these awesome stories. The link is in the description below. And after you do that, check out one of our other videos. We've suggested some here.